Listen closely. Some doors were sealed for a reason. And once you hear what happened beneath the Blackwood house in 1862, you will never fully trust silence again. In the spring of that year, while the Civil War tore the surface of America apart, something quieter was happening in Kentucky, something that did not need cannon fire or marching boots. It happened underground. It happened where records go thin, where names stop appearing, where children vanish not with screams, but with paperwork. The Blackwood Orphans were not a legend at first. They were real children, logged into county ledgers with ink-stained names and assigned numbers. 21 of them. War orphans, famine orphans, children of men who never came back from battles no one remembers correctly. They were placed in the care of the Blackwood Relief Home, a stone building praised in newspapers as a moral refuge for the forgotten. A sanctuary. A blessing. That word should already make you uneasy, because sanctuaries are where power hides best. On the surface, the Blackwood house was ordinary. Stained brick walls, narrow windows, a chapel bell that rang at fixed hours like a heartbeat. But beneath it was a basement that did not appear on architectural plans. No blueprints. No inspections. No funding records. Only later testimonies, whispered decades after the witnesses were old enough to be dismissed as unstable. This is where the story fractures. In 1862, 21 children entered the Blackwood house. Within 18 months, all 21 were gone. No death certificates. No burial plots. No adoption papers. The county ledger simply stops, as if someone dragged a line through their existence and decided that was enough. Officials blamed chaos, war, displacement. But chaos does not erase names this cleanly. Systems do. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story. It is a case study in how institutions learn to disappear people without violence, how moral language becomes a blade, and how obedience is trained young, quietly, efficiently. The basement mattered because basements are where society puts what it does not want to explain. Down there, light thins. Sound changes. Time behaves differently. And children, especially orphaned ones, learn very quickly that survival means compliance. You were never taught this version of history because it is not about tragedy. It is about design. And once you understand what was designed beneath the Blackwood house, you will begin to see the same basement everywhere, beneath schools, churches, governments, even inside your own assumptions. This is where the descent begins. The first thing to understand is that disappearance is rarely sudden. It is gradual, procedural, and wrapped in language that sounds benevolent. The Blackwood house did not steal children in the night. It processed them. Each orphan was catalogued, assessed, and assigned what caretakers called a moral trajectory. That phrase appears once in a surviving margin note, scratched so lightly it almost escaped notice. Moral trajectory did not mean education. It meant usefulness. Kentucky in 1862 was a pressure point. Supply routes crossed there. Refugees passed through. Churches operated as logistical hubs, not just for aid, but for information. Relief homes like Blackwood were not isolated charities. They were nodes in a wider system that merged faith, state necessity, and labor demand. Children without guardians were not mouths to feed. They were raw material. Witness accounts describe the basement as instructional, not punitive at first. Instruction always comes before punishment. The children were taken down in small groups, never all at once, never on a predictable schedule. The stairs were narrow, forcing them into single file. This was not accidental. Single file breaks solidarity. It trains obedience through physical design. Down there, they learned silence. They learned that questions delayed meals. They learned that eye contact invited attention. Older children were separated from younger ones, dissolving the instinct to protect. This is a known technique now. In 1862, it was instinctive to anyone who understood power. What happened next is harder to reconstruct, because the records fracture deliberately. One caretaker's journal, recovered years later from an estate sale, mentions transfer nights. No destinations. No wagons logged. No signatures. Just a count. Numbers going down. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Bodies were never required. The children did not need to die to be erased. They needed to be reassigned. In an era before photographs were mandatory, before centralized identification, a child could be renamed, relocated, and reproposed with minimal friction, especially if no one was waiting for them. The basement functioned as a threshold. Above it, the language of charity. Below it, the mechanics of control. This pattern repeats across history because it works. Institutions survive by appearing moral while operating efficiently. The Blackwood House was not an anomaly. It was an early draft. And once you see that, the story stops being about missing children and starts being about a system that learned something valuable in 1862. If you control the narrative, you never have to answer for the outcome. What made Blackwood effective was not cruelty. It was normalization. The children were not told they were being controlled. They were told they were being saved. Every descent into the basement was framed as correction, preparation, refinement. When power wants longevity, it does not announce itself as force. It announces itself as guidance. Surviving testimonies describe lessons without books, repetitions without explanation, tasks without context. The children were trained to perform actions whose purpose they were never allowed to understand. This is a psychological extraction technique. Remove meaning, leave obedience. A man who understands why he works can resist. A child who only knows that work equals survival cannot. The basement walls were marked with symbols, chalked, wiped away, chalked again. Some were biblical fragments. Others were shapes with no clear reference. The intent was not education. It was imprinting. Symbols bypass logic. They sink deeper. Modern behavioral science would call this precognitive conditioning. In 1862, they called it discipline. Here's where the story sharpens. The Blackwood House received unusual protection. County inspectors visited regularly. On paper. In practice, their signatures repeated with identical handwriting, even across different years. A minister named Elijah Blackwood, never officially listed as director, appeared as a witness on multiple unrelated documents across 3 counties. He traveled freely during wartime, which should have been impossible, unless his work was considered essential. Essential to whom is the question history avoids. Children began vanishing in patterns. Not randomly. Those who resisted disappeared first. Then those who showed leadership. Finally, those who asked questions too early. What remained were compliant bodies, emptied of context, ready to be placed wherever silence was required. Farms, workshops, private households. No records, because records create accountability. You must understand this was not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. There were no cloaked meetings. No single mastermind. This was worse. It was a shared understanding among institutions that certain lives could be redirected without consequence. Once that understanding exists, it does not need coordination. It self-propagates. The basement was never sealed after the children were gone. It was cleaned, lime-washed, repurposed. When the Blackwood House eventually closed, the building was sold as surplus. New owners reported an unease they could not articulate. Sounds that were not sounds. Spaces that felt mismeasured. This is what happens when a place has been used to break identity repeatedly. The architecture remembers even when people refuse to. And this is where the lesson turns toward you. Because the true inheritance of Blackwood is not missing children. It is the proof that control systems do not need chains. They need structure, language, and time. And once you recognize that formula, you begin to see how often it has been reused, how often it is still active, just with better lighting and improved vocabulary. After the war ended, attention shifted. Reconstruction rewrote priorities, and memory became selective. Blackwood slipped through that narrowing lens because it had done its work quietly. No scandal survives without noise. No inquiry survives without survivors willing to speak. The orphans had neither. What remained were secondary traces, anomalies that only stand out if you are trained to look for them. Census gaps. Labor surpluses in rural districts that made no demographic sense. Children appearing in households with no birth records, no baptismal entries, no surnames that could be traced backward. They were listed as wards, helpers, dependents. Language again doing the heavy lifting. This is where forbidden history becomes uncomfortable, because it implicates normalcy. The people who received these children were not monsters in the popular imagination. They were farmers, tradesmen, church elders. They did not ask where the children came from because asking would have required responsibility. Silence was cheaper. A former county clerk, writing anonymously in the 1890s, described it as shadow registry kept during the war years. Lists that were never meant to survive peace. Names entered in pencil. Destinations marked with symbols instead of words. When questioned later, he claimed the registry was destroyed. But destruction itself leaves patterns. Missing volumes. Ledger numbers that skip ahead as if something heavy was torn out. The basement, in retrospect, was not merely a holding space. It was a sorting mechanism. Children were evaluated for temperament, endurance, suggestibility. This is not speculation. It aligns too closely with later industrial practices to ignore. Before factories optimized labor, before militaries refined psychological screening, places like Blackwood were running prototypes on the most defenseless population imaginable. Here is the darker realization most histories refuse to confront. Systems do not learn morality. They learn efficiency. And once an efficient method exists, it does not stay buried. It migrates. It evolves. It sheds its original victims and finds new ones who do not recognize the pattern yet. By the time rumors about Blackwood resurfaced, decades had passed. Investigators found no bones because bones were never the point. The crime was not murder. It was conversion, turning children into assets without consent, turning identity into something transferable. If this feels distant, that is intentional. Distance is how dangerous knowledge is neutralized. You are taught to see these events as relics, as mistakes of a less enlightened era. But the structure you are looking at, the basement beneath the benevolent institution, never disappeared. It only learned to build higher floors above itself, so no one would think to look down. There is a reason no one teaches you how to recognize a control system while you are inside it. Recognition is the only real threat. The Blackwood house succeeded because it trained perception as much as behavior. The children learned not just what to do, but how to interpret reality itself. Hunger became a teacher. Approval became oxygen. Confusion became normal. This is how psychological ownership is established without chains. One recovered account, buried in a regional historical journal no one reads, describes a boy who escaped Blackwood at 14. He did not run far. He walked into the nearest town and waited. When asked his name, he could not answer. When asked where he was from, he pointed backward but could not describe the place. He had been trained to understand location only in terms of permission. Without authority present, his identity collapsed. That is not trauma by accident. That is trauma by design. What happened in the basement was not about secrecy for its own sake. It was about breaking the internal compass that tells a human being when something is wrong. Once that compass is damaged early enough, external control becomes unnecessary. The individual self-polices. This is the most cost-effective form of domination ever discovered. You can see why it spread. After Blackwood, similar relief structures appeared under different names. Industrial schools, moral academies, reform houses. Each claimed salvation. Each operated with partial oversight. Each relied on the same assumption, that children without advocates could be reshaped without consequence. When outcomes went missing, paperwork absorbed the blame. Notice how the story never requires evil intent from everyone involved. That is another reason it worked. Most participants believed they were maintaining order. Order is the favorite disguise of corruption because it sounds virtuous. It appeals to men who value stability, hierarchy, and purpose. Those instincts can be weaponized if never examined. And this is where the Blackwood story crosses from history into warning. Because the basement is not a physical place anymore. It is a structural layer. It exists wherever authority is unquestionable, where dependency is cultivated, where language replaces transparency. It exists in systems that reward compliance while punishing curiosity. It exists wherever men are trained to accept explanations instead of demanding understanding. The children of Blackwood were not lost because no one cared. They were lost because enough people cared about order more than truth. That is a distinction worth sitting with. Once you see it, you begin to recognize the same pattern in modern institutions that swear they exist for your protection. Different uniforms, cleaner floors, better branding, same logic underneath. And the most dangerous part is this: the system does not fear outrage. It fears awareness. Outrage burns hot and fast. Awareness rewires how a man moves through the world. That is why this knowledge was buried, and why, once uncovered, it never leaves you unchanged. When people finally began asking questions about Blackwood, they asked the wrong ones. They wanted to know who was responsible, who signed the papers, who ordered the transfers. Those questions feel powerful, but they are safe. Systems can sacrifice individuals. They cannot survive exposure of their architecture. The architecture of Blackwood was dependency. The orphans were fed just enough to stay functional, educated just enough to follow instructions, praised just enough to crave approval. This calibrated scarcity created a psychological gravity well. The children did not need to be locked in. Leaving meant starvation, confusion, and punishment by a world that did not recognize them. Freedom without identity is not freedom. It is exile. This is why no mass escape ever occurred. Records show that the children were taught hymns obsessively, not for faith, but for rhythm. Rhythm regulates emotion. Repetition dulls resistance. When sung in groups, it dissolves individuality. Modern militaries still use this technique. So do corporations. So do ideological movements. Blackwood did it first, quietly, without theory, only results. One detail surfaces again and again in testimonies. Mirrors were absent in the basement. Not broken. Not covered. Simply not present. This matters more than it seems. Mirrors reinforce self-recognition. Without them, the sense of a stable identity weakens over time, especially in children. You stop seeing yourself as a continuous being and start seeing yourself as a role. Roles are easy to reassign. By the time a child was removed from Blackwood, whether to a farm, a workshop, or a household, they were already conditioned to accept their new designation without resistance. New name. New rules. Same internal silence. The basement had done its job. Ask yourself why this pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. Because modern systems do not need basements. They need onboarding processes, training modules, cultural values. They need men to internalize authority so deeply that rebellion feels irrational, even immoral. The genius of Blackwood was not cruelty. It was foresight. This is the part history avoids, because it forces an admission. Progress did not replace control systems. It refined them. What was once crude and physical became subtle and psychological. What was once hidden underground now operates in plain sight, protected by legality and consensus. The children of Blackwood disappeared because the system learned something valuable from them, something it would never unlearn. And here's the threshold moment for you. Once you understand that control is most effective when it feels voluntary, you start questioning the moments in your own life where compliance felt like choice, where obedience was rewarded as maturity, where silence was framed as wisdom. This is not about paranoia. It is about pattern recognition. Blackwood is not asking you to be afraid of history. It is asking you to stop assuming that time automatically makes systems more humane. Some systems do not want you broken. They want you functional, predictable, and grateful. That realization is the beginning of real autonomy, and it is why the descent is not over yet. There is a moment in every control system when enforcement gives way to inheritance. Blackwood reached that moment quietly. The children who remained longest were not merely compliant. They became assistants. They corrected others. They enforced routines. They repeated language they did not originate but now believed. This is how systems reproduce without constant oversight. No overseer is more efficient than a converted subject. A surviving note from a visiting clergyman describes the children as remarkably orderly, unusually reserved, and mature beyond their years. That sentence reads like praise. In reality, it is a diagnostic report. Childhood curiosity had been stripped out, playfulness eliminated, spontaneity replaced with anticipation of command. The children were not peaceful. They were neutralized. This matters because neutralization is the goal most systems pursue once resistance becomes inconvenient. A neutral man does not rebel. He adapts. He rationalizes. He waits for permission. The Blackwood house understood something most institutions learn the hard way. Punishment creates memory, but reward creates loyalty. The children who complied were given small privileges, extra food, a warmer blanket, proximity to authority. These rewards were meaningless in any normal context. Inside Blackwood, they were everything. Scarcity turns crumbs into currency. Over time, the children stopped seeing themselves as captives and began seeing themselves as chosen. Chosen to help. Chosen to lead prayers. Chosen to escort others to the basement. This is the most dangerous psychological turn, because once identity binds to the system, exposure feels like annihilation. To question the structure would be to question the self. And so the system stabilized. When transfers occurred, they were framed as advancement. You have been selected. Selection language masks extraction. It makes loss feel like achievement. This tactic did not end with Blackwood. It appears later in conscription, in labor pipelines, in ideological movements that promised belonging in exchange for obedience. The basement was no longer needed once the mindset took root. By the final months, fewer children were taken downstairs. The structure had moved inside them. Authority no longer needed to loom. It only needed to be implied. This is the mark of a mature control system: minimal force, maximum compliance. History rarely records this phase because nothing dramatic happens. No blood, no riots, no ruins, just efficiency. This is why the Blackwood story is dangerous to study. It teaches you that the most effective forms of domination are boring to watch and devastating to live under. They do not announce themselves as evil. They announce themselves as necessary. And once necessity becomes unquestionable, morality becomes irrelevant. If you are paying attention, you may feel a subtle discomfort here. Not fear, but recognition. That sensation is not accidental. It is what happens when a buried pattern surfaces and brushes against something current. Because Blackwood did not invent these methods. It proved they worked. And proof is what allows systems to persist long after the original building is gone. The descent continues, because the next layer is not about children anymore. It is about men. Once the methods were proven on children, their adaptation to adults was inevitable. Children teach a system what is possible. Men teach it how far it can go. The transition did not require innovation, only translation. What worked in the basement could be scaled upward, disguised as duty, framed as honor. After Blackwood closed, its influence did not vanish. It diffused. Men who had passed through similar institutions, reform schools, workhouses, military camps, carried the conditioning forward without realizing it had a source. They enforced rules they did not write. They defended structures they did not benefit from. They mistook endurance for virtue and silence for strength. This is where forbidden history becomes personal. The same psychological mechanics that shaped the orphans were later repackaged for adults: regimented schedules, symbolic rituals, controlled scarcity, identity labels that replaced individuality. The difference was consent, manufactured consent. A man who believes he chose the structure will protect it more fiercely than one who was forced into it. Blackwood's basement trained submission through dependency. Adult systems train it through meaning. Purpose is the adult version of bread. Give a man a narrative that frames his obedience as contribution, and he will police himself harder than any overseer ever could. This is not speculation. Look at how institutions reward endurance over insight. How questioning is reframed as negativity. How loyalty is praised even when it contradicts evidence. These are not moral failures. They are inherited design features. There is a reason men are taught history as a sequence of battles and dates instead of systems and methods. Battles inspire emotion. Methods inspire recognition. Recognition threatens continuity. The Blackwood story was buried not because it was uniquely horrific, but because it was instructional. It showed how to disappear people without killing them, how to extract labor without revolt, how to break identity without visible scars. Those lessons were too useful to discard. And here's the part most men resist at first. The system does not need to hate you. Hatred is inefficient. Indifference is enough. If you are functional, predictable, and replaceable, the system is satisfied. Your inner life is irrelevant as long as your output remains stable. This is why men who sense something wrong often feel isolated. The discomfort is not shared language yet. It has not been named. Blackwood teaches us that naming comes last. Control operates best before language catches up. You are not being asked to reject society. You are being asked to see its scaffolding. To notice where obedience is confused with discipline, where endurance is confused with power, where silence is confused with wisdom. Because once you see the scaffolding, you can no longer confuse the building for reality. And that awareness, quiet, unsettling, irreversible, is the first thing no control system can ever afford to give you willingly. There is a final layer most men never reach, because it requires abandoning the comfort of blame. Blackwood was not sustained by villains. It was sustained by alignment. Alignment between church, state, economy, and faith. When interests converge, ethics dissolve without anyone needing to announce it. This is how forbidden systems survive exposure. They fragment responsibility until no single hand appears guilty. In the Blackwood case, every participant could justify their role. The clergy spoke of salvation. The county spoke of order. Employers spoke of opportunity. Families spoke of charity. Each explanation was internally coherent. Together, they formed a machine that consumed identity and produced compliance. No conspiracy required. Only incentives. That is the truth men are rarely taught to confront. Power does not always arrive as oppression. Often it arrives as coordination, as efficiency, as the way things must be done. Once a process becomes normalized, questioning it feels irrational, even dangerous. You are not resisting authority. You are resisting consensus. And consensus is one of the strongest psychological cages ever built. Blackwood's greatest protection was respectability. The building stood in daylight. Its leaders wore familiar faces. Its language mirrored virtue. This is why no uprising occurred. Outrage requires contrast. When control looks like normal life, resistance feels like madness. Here is the mechanism that matters most: gradual moral displacement. Small compromises made early, ignoring a missing name, accepting an unexplained transfer, justifying silence for the greater good, accumulate into a structure no one feels capable of stopping. By the time the outcome is undeniable, the system is too embedded to confront without threatening stability itself. Stability is the ultimate hostage. This is why men are trained to value order above truth. Order keeps systems intact. Truth destabilizes them. Blackwood did not fear discovery. It feared disruption. As long as life appeared orderly above ground, no one had incentive to dig. And notice how this logic persists. Modern institutions rarely collapse because they are exposed as corrupt. They collapse when their outputs no longer serve the population that sustains them. Ethics follow usefulness, not the other way around. Blackwood functioned until it was no longer needed in that form. Then it was quietly retired, its methods absorbed elsewhere. The lesson is not cynicism. It is clarity. If you want to understand power, stop looking for cruelty. Look for coordination. Look for who benefits from silence, who profits from normalization, who frames obedience as maturity. These are the fingerprints that never change. Blackwood is a reminder that history's most effective control systems do not announce themselves as enemies. They present themselves as caretakers. And the moment you accept care without questioning cost is the moment you begin walking toward the basement, whether you realize it or not. By the time Blackwood faded from public memory, its most important work was already complete. It had proven that control does not require secrecy forever, only long enough to become tradition. Once a method embeds itself into routine, it no longer needs to be hidden. It becomes invisible. This is where men misunderstand power. They imagine it as a force that must constantly assert itself. In reality, the most stable systems operate by expectation. You do not need guards when people already know where they are supposed to stand. You do not need threats when deviation feels socially expensive. Blackwood's basement was a laboratory for expectation management. Children learned that deviation led to discomfort, while alignment led to relief. Over time, the nervous system adapts. Anxiety becomes the signal for correction. Calm becomes the reward for submission. This rewiring does not disappear with age. It matures. It becomes what people call being realistic. That word, realistic, has ended more rebellions than violence ever has. After Blackwood, many of the children who were redistributed grew into adults who never questioned why authority felt familiar, why hierarchy felt comforting, why obedience felt like safety. They did not see themselves as controlled. They saw themselves as adjusted. That is the triumph of any system that seeks permanence. You can trace this inheritance across generations. Men teach their sons discipline without teaching discernment. They pass down endurance, but not agency. They warn against risk without explaining who benefits from caution. None of this is malicious. It is inherited orientation. This is why control systems prefer to shape early environments. By the time a man believes he chose his values, the values have already chosen him. Blackwood was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to be replicated. Not as a building, but as a pattern. Identify the vulnerable, frame authority as protection, restrict alternatives, reward alignment, normalize silence. Once internalized, the system sustains itself. And here's the quiet realization that separates observers from participants. You cannot dismantle a system you believe you benefit from. As long as a structure provides stability, status, or identity, even in small doses, you will defend it, rationalize it, excuse its costs. This is not weakness. It is conditioning doing exactly what it was designed to do. The reason this knowledge feels heavy is because it removes the comfort of innocence. It forces you to ask not only who controls, but where have I accepted control because it was convenient? Blackwood's legacy is not horror. It is efficiency. And efficiency is always seductive, because it promises order without requiring understanding. But order without understanding is simply obedience with better marketing. And once you see that distinction, you begin to realize why true autonomy has always been rare, not because men are incapable of it, but because they are rarely taught how to recognize the structures that quietly profit from its absence. There is a moment in every man's life when he senses that the rules he followed were never written for him. Blackwood exists to teach that moment. The basement, the missing children, the disappearing names, all of it points to a single principle. Systems do not fail because they are evil. They fail when awareness outpaces obedience. Awareness is dangerous because it bypasses ritual, language, and reward. It sees structure without needing permission. The children of Blackwood could not reach that point. They were stripped of foresight. But you can. That is why the story matters now. The basement was more than a room. It was a curriculum in submission. Each task, each rule, each whispered threat was designed to fracture confidence just enough so that authority seemed absolute. Over time, the child's own mind became a prison. The system did not have to watch constantly. It had trained its subjects to self-regulate. This is what modern institutions borrow. They do not need punishment. They need normalization. They do not need overt control. They need a rhythm that conditions perception, attention, and expectation. And when enough people internalize that rhythm, the structure becomes invisible, even sacred. Notice the pattern: scarcity, repetition, reward, expectation. Scarcity teaches desire, repetition teaches predictability, reward teaches preference, expectation teaches compliance. It is elegant in its cruelty. It is quiet, and it works across centuries, continents, and ideologies. By the time authorities noticed anomalies in Blackwood, it was already too late. The children who could have resisted were gone, replaced by those who could endure. Endurance is mistaken for resilience. Compliance is mistaken for virtue. Silence is mistaken for wisdom. And here is the turning point for you. Understanding is not neutral. Once you perceive the scaffolding, you begin to feel its pressure. That is why men rarely look too closely. Curiosity threatens cohesion. Observation threatens conformity. Awareness threatens safety in numbers. But there is power in noticing. There is liberation in seeing the basement as it is. Not a room, but a principle. And if you are willing, you can trace its echoes everywhere. Institutions, ideologies, workplaces, social hierarchies. The lesson of Blackwood is that domination is most effective when it masquerades as care, when compliance feels voluntary, and when silence is framed as virtue. Halfway through this descent, I want you to lock in what you now understand. Comment below. I see the basement. Twice. Say it not as affirmation, but as recognition. Let the words settle. They are the first keys in reclaiming perception from systems that would prefer you unquestioning. Because recognition is the only rebellion that cannot be erased. Once recognition is established, the mind begins to map the hidden architecture. You start to notice the subtle forces around you. Who benefits when information is withheld? Who shapes behavior with ritual rather than orders? Who frames obedience as morality? These are the invisible scaffolds of control, the modern basements of power. Blackwood was a prototype. Its lessons are still in play, refined, repackaged, made palatable. Today's systems do not need children to vanish. They need the same compliance cultivated in adults. Identity broken into roles, desires redirected toward alignment, questioning reframed as disloyalty. Efficiency does not require cruelty, only subtlety. The people who ran Blackwood were not monsters. They were tacticians. They understood a principle that remains largely ignored. Authority does not need fists or chains when it can shape minds, direct loyalty, and normalize obedience. Power internalized is stronger than power imposed. The children who survived, or rather, who were molded, became walking instruments of the system. They did not realize they were teaching others how to obey, how to self-regulate, how to accept hierarchy as inevitable. This is the hidden multiplier effect. One trained subject can shape a dozen others without force. Here's a truth men rarely confront. The basement is not a place. It is a process. It exists wherever structure overrides inquiry, where compliance masquerades as understanding, where roles replace identity. And the longer it goes unnoticed, the more permanent it becomes. Notice how often you accept order without asking why. Notice how small compromises become habits. Notice how obedience feels like maturity. Blackwood teaches that the most dangerous chains are invisible, constructed not from metal, but from thought, expectation, and internalized authority. And yet, recognition is not resignation. Awareness is a weapon, a lens through which the train children to obey. Modern institutions train adults the same way. And the methods are subtle, nearly invisible, yet profoundly effective. Think of the moments you complied without question. Moments you deferred to authority, not because you feared it, but because it felt necessary, natural, or moral. Those were your internal basements at work. Blackwood shows how easily identity can be conditioned to accept limits as rules, roles as selfhood, and obedience as wisdom. Notice the rhythm: expectation, reward, normalization. Expectation conditions attention, reward binds desire, normalization erases doubt. These are the same principles used on the orphans. Only now, the targets are older, more sophisticated, but not immune. Maturity does not inoculate against conditioning, it only masks it. The most efficient systems do not coerce, they guide. They create environments where choice is structured to produce compliance. They reward alignment before conscious thought, penalize deviation through subtle social friction, and gradually erode the capacity to question the framework itself. This is what Blackwood perfected. And here's the darkest truth: the children who survived were never free. They were functional. They were normalized. They could perform, obey, and appear content. But identity had been fragmented. Selfhood had been displaced by the system. And this is exactly how control survives. Not through fear, but through internalized obedience. You begin to see the invisible scaffolds everywhere: your workplaces, your communities, your social circles. Rituals that enforce hierarchy, rewards that shape perception, silence that reinforces order. Each is a modern basement, quietly training compliance. And the people who inhabit them often defend the structure because it feels safe, necessary, inevitable. Blackwood teaches that the most dangerous control is that which feels voluntary. Obedience internalized is obedience multiplied. Compliance without chains is compliance without awareness. And once the mind accepts the structure, resistance feels unnatural, even irrational. This is the point where men begin to confront themselves. To question conditioning is to question identity. To see the basement within is to see how deeply influence has shaped thought, behavior, and desire. And that awareness is not comfortable. It is powerful, but heavy. Recognition is irreversible. Awareness is unavoidable. The moment you acknowledge the patterns Blackwood exemplified, you cannot return to ignorance. You can only move forward, with clarity, caution, and the knowledge that systems survive best when you believe you chose them. The descent continues, because the next revelation is not about history or systems. It is about mastering the basement inside yourself. The internal basement is where the most insidious lessons are reinforced. It is not visible. It is no bricks or mortar. It exists in habits, beliefs, and expectations. Blackwood trained the children to accept authority externally. Modern systems train men to accept it internally, often without realizing they are doing so. Consider the ways your own mind is being structured. Where do you hesitate before acting? Where do you censor yourself? Where do you obey protocols, rituals, or social norms without questioning their origin? Those are the shadows of the basement, quietly shaping thought, predicting behavior, guiding desire. Blackwood shows us that control is less about punishment and more about shaping perception. Once a child, or a man, learns to measure actions against expectation rather than morality, obedience becomes instinct. Once anticipation dictates behavior, freedom becomes a memory. And anticipation is cultivated, not imposed. Think of reward. Even the smallest reinforcement, praise, attention, inclusion, teaches compliance. In the basement, a smile could replace a whip. In the wider world, recognition, status, or approval achieves the same effect. The system does not need force. It only needs subtle guidance. And yet, comprehension brings opportunity. Awareness is a tool. Recognizing the basement inside your mind allows you to navigate it consciously. You begin to see where alignment has been mistaken for autonomy, where roles have been mistaken for identity, where obedience has been mistaken for virtue. Blackwood teaches that systems propagate not by fear alone, but by creating willing participants. Once a subject internalizes the rules, the system's longevity is assured. The lesson is clear. Real freedom begins with understanding the conditioning you carry. This is where most men stop. The basement is uncomfortable. It demands self-reflection, honesty, and courage. It forces a confrontation with choices made under influence, compromises accepted as necessity, obedience mistaken for judgment. But here's the turning point. Comprehension is power. Awareness allows you to reclaim the space the basement occupies in your mind. Recognition converts passive conditioning into conscious strategy. You may not be able to erase influence, but you can control how it shapes you going forward. And that is why the descent deepens now. The next revelation is not just about seeing the basement. It is about learning to master it, to use the understanding of control as a tool for autonomy, not a trap for compliance. From here, the lessons become actionable. The next step is not observation. It is application. Mastery begins with identification. First, you must map the basement inside yourself. Observe where obedience feels automatic, where fear constrains thought, where ritual shapes decision. These are the foundations laid by systems long before you were aware. Blackwood perfected this on children. Modern institutions perfect it on adults. The principle is identical: anticipate behavior, direct attention, reward alignment. The next layer is interrogation. Ask why you follow certain rules. Ask why approval feels necessary. Ask why silence often seems safer than speech. Each question is a key. Each insight a step upward from the basement. Without this scrutiny, recognition is incomplete. Awareness without inquiry is passive. It is observation, not liberation. Then comes extraction, not of identity, but of control. Identify which elements of your behavior are genuinely your own, and which are the product of normalized expectation. The difference is subtle, but crucial. Blackwood trained the children to confuse compliance with survival. Adults, too, confuse alignment with prudence, habit with choice. Separating the two is essential. Reward yourself for clarity. Each acknowledgement of influence is a small liberation. Recognition alone shifts internal dynamics. The basement loses authority when you measure its boundaries consciously. The more you observe its mechanics, the less it dictates instinctively. This is where agency begins to assert itself. Finally, reconstruction. Rebuild identity with awareness as your foundation. Retain efficiency without surrendering. Autonomy. Align with systems when it serves you. Resist when it diminishes you. Choose loyalty consciously, not reflexively. In the basement of the mind, autonomy is the ultimate act of defiance. Blackwood's lesson is stark. Survival does not equal freedom. Compliance does not equal virtue. Obedience does not equal morality. Structures are designed to perpetuate themselves, not to serve you. Recognizing this is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront how deeply your own choices may have been conditioned. But discomfort is necessary. It is the signal that awareness is active, that the basement has been illuminated, that the patterns no longer operate unnoticed. This is the moment of transformation, the first step toward autonomy in a world designed to normalize compliance. And remember, mastery does not mean isolation. It means understanding influence, navigating power, and reclaiming the interior space systems hope to control. The descent is not an end. It is preparation. Awareness must now translate into strategy, not just observation. The next phase takes the knowledge of the basement and turns it outward, into action, influence, and the conscious shaping of your world. This is where history's lessons become survival tools, and where understanding becomes power. Now, you move from recognition to navigation. The basement is no longer a curiosity or a historical artifact. It is a living framework inside you and around you. Blackwood trained children to obey. Modern systems train men to accept invisible boundaries. Awareness alone does not free you. You must learn to operate consciously within the structure while asserting autonomy. Step 1. Perception. Notice where the system channels your attention. Where are you rewarded for alignment and punished, silently, for deviation? Which rituals, habits, and expectations guide behavior without scrutiny? These are the same principles Blackwood applied. Subtle, constant, unremarkable, but shaping thought at every level. Step 2. Testing. Small deviations illuminate control. Break routine in minor ways. Question assumptions in low-stakes contexts. Observe your discomfort and note the source. The basement thrives on internalized expectation. Once expectation is challenged safely, its power diminishes. Step 3. Differentiation. Identify which rules serve you and which serve only the system. Obedience is efficient, autonomy is essential. Align when it benefits, resist when it restricts. The Blackwood method relied on confusion, on teaching children to accept alignment as virtue. Differentiation reverses that. Step 4. Amplification. Influence the system consciously. Use knowledge of its mechanics to operate strategically. Recognize that those who control subtly rely on predictability. Disrupt predictability. Introduce informed variance, and you regain agency. This is not chaos. It is deliberate mastery. Step 5. Transmission. Awareness becomes strength when shared selectively. Observe others' patterns without imposing. Teach recognition indirectly. Systems perpetuate when unexamined. They falter when consciousness spreads. The Blackwood basement illustrates the power of conditioning, but also the weakness inherent in reliance on internalized obedience. This is the turning point. Recognition transforms into strategy. Observation transforms into control. Awareness transforms into autonomy. The basement loses power when illuminated and navigated deliberately. Its principles are universal, but its control is conditional, dependent on unexamined minds. Here is the most critical lesson. You cannot dismantle a system by fighting it blindly. You must understand it fully, operate within its logic, and redirect its mechanisms for your own agency. Blackwood's children were too young to do this. Adults, equipped with awareness, are not. And now you are beyond mere comprehension. You are prepared to engage, to operate consciously, to reclaim the space the basement once occupied in your mind. The descent is no longer passive. It becomes strategic, deliberate, and transformative. The next section will take this strategy further, exposing how systems multiply and evolve, and how true autonomy requires mastering not just observation, but influence. Control is never static. Blackwood's basement worked because it adapted, observing responses, calibrating rewards, and refining its methods. Modern systems are no different. They evolve, integrate new tools, and exploit patterns you fail to notice. Awareness alone is insufficient. You must anticipate adaptation. Step 1. Trace replication. Systems reproduce by teaching subjects to enforce structure unconsciously. Blackwood's children became instruments of compliance. Modern equivalents do the same. Employees, citizens, even peers transmit expectations and habits without realizing it. Understanding this is essential. Influence multiplies through internalization. Step 2. Recognize incentives. Control systems rarely use direct force. They use leverage. Scarcity, recognition, approval, belonging. These are the currencies. Like Blackwood's calculated rewards, they train behavior more efficiently than punishment ever could. Observe what is valued and why, and you understand how compliance is maintained. Step 3. Detect normalization. Obedience feels natural because repetition and ritual make it so. Patterns become invisible when internalized. Most people defend the very structures that shape them because the alternative feels disorienting. Recognition is the first step. Questioning and differentiation are the next. Step 4. Operate consciously. Once you see the basement, you can navigate it deliberately. Engage with systems strategically. Align when beneficial, resist when harmful. Predict reactions based on observed patterns, and maintain autonomy while functioning within them. Efficiency and freedom are not mutually exclusive when mastery is applied. Step 5. Cultivate self-regulation. Systems rely on internalized control. Blackwood trained children to self-police. Adults, too, operate under conditioned expectations. Recognize moments when you comply automatically. Question them. Introduce conscious decision-making to reclaim control over instinctual obedience. Here is the key insight. The basement works because it is invisible and self-reinforcing. Once illuminated, it loses power, but only if you act deliberately. Observation without action is recognition without liberation. Knowledge must convert into strategy to be effective. Blackwood teaches that the mechanics of control are universal, adaptable, and timeless. The basement exists wherever expectation replaces choice, alignment replaces freedom, and compliance is celebrated as virtue. Understanding these mechanics allows you to reclaim autonomy not by opposing the system blindly, but by mastering it consciously. And now, the descent begins to converge. Awareness, recognition, and strategy are in place. The next phase examines the final, most insidious layer: how systems shape identity itself, and how true autonomy while functioning externally. Then, convert insight into action. Predict outcomes, make deliberate choices, and introduce variance in behavior to disrupt internalized expectation. Autonomy is reinforced not through opposition, but through conscious engagement. The system loses its grip when its subjects act intentionally rather than reflexively. Equally crucial is self-reinforcement. Blackwood taught obedience through scarcity and reward. Adults must cultivate internal reinforcement through deliberate metrics, self-validation, and principled standards. Let external approval be secondary. Let strategic alignment with your values guide decisions. This fortifies identity against invisible conditioning. Finally, understand replication. Systems propagate when internalized obedience spreads. Blackwood's children became teachers of compliance without realizing it. Adults, too, influence others unconsciously. Recognize this potential and use it consciously. Model autonomy, introduce awareness, and create deliberate influence rather than passive compliance. The basement survives by remaining invisible. Illuminate it fully, and it becomes navigable rather than controlling. Strategy transforms recognition into power. Observation becomes action. Awareness becomes sovereignty. The critical insight is this: mastery is not about dismantling every structure, but about reclaiming the decision-making that those structures attempt to monopolize. Every choice, every ritual, every expectation now becomes a deliberate exercise in autonomy rather than compliance. And now, the descent reaches its operational phase. Understanding, awareness, and strategic application converge, preparing you to act deliberately within systems designed to shape thought, behavior, and identity. The next section reveals how to consolidate this mastery into enduring personal sovereignty. Consolidation is the final frontier of autonomy. Blackwood's basement shows how control multiplies silently. Children obeyed, internalized rules, and then reinforced them themselves. Adults face a similar challenge, but with awareness as a weapon. Recognition alone is insufficient. You must integrate insight into deliberate, consistent action. Begin by auditing habits. Identify routines and rituals that reinforce alignment with expectation rather than self-determined purpose. Small, seemingly inconsequential acts, early morning rituals, social interactions, work protocols, can carry subtle influence. Awareness allows you to reclaim these behaviors as intentional choices rather than automatic responses. Next, establish internal metrics. Blackwood's children sought approval to survive. Adults seek it to conform. Measure success according to personal principles, not external validation. Autonomy thrives when reward is internal, predictable, and aligned with conscious values. External systems become tools rather than masters. Then, enforce boundaries deliberately. Systems, like Blackwood, rely on permeable lines between compliance and selfhood. Distinguish where influence ends and your judgment begins. Protect cognitive space. Decide which expectations you will follow, which you will resist, and which you will navigate strategically. Each boundary strengthens autonomy. Amplify awareness through selective influence. Observe how behaviors propagate. The children of Blackwood unknowingly trained others. Adults can reverse this process, model conscious action, reinforce recognition, and introduce deliberate variance in environments that previously shaped behavior unconsciously. Autonomy becomes contagious. Finally, integrate strategic reflection. Awareness is a living process. Systems evolve. Continuous observation and adjustment prevent regression into automatic compliance. Each act of reflection reinforces identity, clarifies priorities, and strengthens the internal architecture against invisible control. Blackwood demonstrates a timeless truth. Domination is most effective when invisible, subtle, and internalized. Mastery is most enduring when deliberate, conscious, and self-reinforced. The basement loses power not by destruction, but by illumination, strategic engagement, and identity reclamation. From here, autonomy is not theoretical, it is operational. Recognition, strategy, and self-determination converge into deliberate action. The descent into forbidden knowledge transforms into the ascent of sovereignty. The next section will reveal how systems evolve, replicate, and persist, and how mastering these dynamics allows you to operate not merely in survival, but in enduring influence and personal power. Systems evolve. Blackwood's basement was a prototype. Its methods were refined, repackaged, and applied in countless structures over time. Control survives not through fear alone, but through adaptation. Modern systems anticipate behavior, reward alignment, and normalize compliance, just as Blackwood did, but with greater subtlety and reach. Begin by observing patterns. Where do small, repeated pressures guide behavior? Where are rituals and incentives shaping decisions without explicit direction? Blackwood trained children with scarcity, repetition, and reward. Contemporary structures do the same with culture, information, and expectation. Recognize these patterns and you map the invisible scaffolding. Next, anticipate adaptation. Systems adjust when challenged. Blackwood refined methods based on responses, calibrating the intensity of control. Awareness gives you an advantage. By predicting adjustments, you can operate strategically, maintain autonomy, and avoid being reshaped unconsciously. Then, identify leverage points. Control persists where it goes unexamined. Question assumptions, test boundaries, and intervene deliberately. Each act of conscious decision-making reduces the basement's influence. Awareness combined with action converts recognition into tactical advantage. Equally vital is resilience. Systems exploit internalized compliance. You must reinforce principles, self-validation, and deliberate metrics continuously. Without resilience, awareness can overwhelm, producing doubt or paralysis. Mastery requires that observation translate into structured, sustainable agency. Finally, extend influence consciously. Blackwood's children propagated obedience unknowingly. Adults can propagate autonomy intentionally. Model deliberate choice, introduce awareness selectively, and create environments that encourage reflection over instinctive compliance. Influence becomes a tool rather than a trap. The basement survives by remaining hidden. Illuminate its mechanisms fully, and it becomes navigable rather than controlling. Strategy converts recognition into power. Observation transforms into mastery. Awareness solidifies sovereignty. The next stage takes this framework further. How to recognize and counter advanced replication of control in institutions, ideologies, and cultures, and how to operate within these systems with deliberate, informed authority. The descent now reaches the level of influence itself. Influence is the ultimate frontier. Blackwood's basement proves that control multiplies when internalized and propagated. Awareness alone does not suffice. Mastery requires understanding how influence travels, how patterns, expectations, and rituals silently shape behavior across generations. Begin by tracing replication. Systems endure because trained subjects reproduce compliance. Children who survived the basement taught others unwittingly. Modern systems do the same with adults, employees, students, citizens, even peers transmit conditioning unconsciously. Observing these networks allows you to anticipate mechanisms of control. Next, recognize leverage. Where does subtle reward or penalty dictate behavior? Where are rituals reinforcing alignment without scrutiny? Blackwood exploited scarcity and praise. Today, recognition, status, belonging, and approval serve the same purpose. Awareness of these levers allows you to act deliberately rather than reactively. Then, intervene strategically. Small deviations in controlled contexts expose boundaries. Test assumptions, introduce variance, and observe outcomes. Each act of deliberate divergence diminishes the system's unexamined authority and trains the mind to resist internalized control. Simultaneously, cultivate intentional propagation. Influence spreads automatically when unconscious. Consciously, it becomes a tool. Model autonomy. Teach recognition indirectly, and reinforce principles that strengthen identity and deliberate action rather than compliance. Awareness now becomes transmissible. Finally, consolidate sovereignty. Observation, strategy, and identity reconstruction converge. Systems rely on predictability. Conscious deviation reclaims agency. Autonomy becomes a force multiplier, extending not only personal freedom but the ability to operate effectively within and around the structures that once dominated unseen. Blackwood teaches the blueprint. Control is subtle, self-propagating, and sustained by internalization. Mastery inverts this. Awareness, deliberate action, and strategic influence dismantle invisible authority without overt confrontation. The basement is no longer a trap, it is a map. From here, the descent shifts focus to endurance, how to maintain autonomy over time, resist systemic pressures, and navigate evolving structures without losing identity or control. Recognition becomes practice, insight becomes habit, and mastery becomes lived reality. The next section will illuminate the final mechanisms by which systems attempt to endure, and how mastery transforms awareness into enduring, operational freedom. Endurance is the measure of true mastery. Blackwood's basement persisted because its lessons were embedded, normalized, and propagated. Modern systems function the same way. They survive not by force, but by shaping expectation, reinforcing compliance, and exploiting the inertia of habit. Autonomy is fragile unless reinforced consistently. Begin by fortifying attention. Systems exploit distraction and habit. Observe where mental energy is consumed unconsciously. Rituals, social pressures, internalized norms. Reclaim focus deliberately. Awareness without attention is recognition without reinforcement. The basement thrives when minds wander unexamined. Next, solidify identity. Blackwood trained children to align self-perception with compliance. Adults must reverse this, define principles, establish internal metrics, and reinforce boundaries. Repetition of conscious, deliberate action strengthens internal architecture against invisible influence. Identity becomes your anchor, not a reflection of expectation. Then, develop adaptive strategy. Systems evolve. Blackwood adjusted rules based on response. Anticipate subtle shifts in incentives, norms, and rewards. Strategically engage or resist depending on alignment with your goals. Mastery is not opposition, it is deliberate navigation. Survival requires understanding the evolving landscape. Simultaneously, cultivate internal reinforcement. Systems rely on external reward. Adults can internalize their own. Validation, self-measured progress, and deliberate judgment replace expectation-driven compliance. Each conscious act of alignment with your own principles strengthens autonomy. Finally, integrate vigilance with reflection. Observe patterns continuously, analyze outcomes, and adjust behavior deliberately. Blackwood relied on predictability. Conscious, informed variance destabilizes inherited control. Autonomy is maintained not in isolation but through deliberate, ongoing engagement with forces that seek to shape perception and action. The basement survives through invisibility, repetition, and internalized compliance. Endurance transforms recognition into sustained freedom. Awareness becomes habitual. Strategic engagement becomes instinctive. Identity becomes resilient. And now, the descent reaches its operational peak, the mechanisms of long-term autonomy. The next section will reveal how to anticipate systemic evolution, maintain sovereignty, and wield influence deliberately, ensuring that mastery is not temporary but enduring. Long-term autonomy requires anticipation. Blackwood's basement shows that systems endure by observing, adapting, and propagating control. Recognition alone is not enough. To maintain freedom, you must predict patterns, understand incentives, and act before conditioning reasserts itself. Begin by mapping recurring structures. Where do authority, ritual, and expectation converge? Which systems reward alignment, subtly penalize deviation, and propagate internalized obedience? Observation here is tactical. Identifying patterns allows preemptive navigation rather than reactive adjustment. Next, anticipate evolution. Control systems adapt to resistance. Blackwood modified rules based on behavior. Modern structures adjust incentives, information flow, and social pressures. Understanding this allows you to maintain autonomy while operating strategically within evolving constraints. Then, create self-reinforcing cycles. Systems survive by leveraging rewards and penalties. Adults must internalize their own reinforcement, principles, metrics, deliberate habits. Each conscious choice strengthens internal authority over automatic compliance. Autonomy is sustained through repetition of intentional behavior. Simultaneously, extend influence consciously. Just as Blackwood's children propagated compliance unknowingly, adults can propagate autonomy intentionally. Model deliberate choice, reinforce awareness in peers, and introduce strategic variance to reduce predictability. Influence becomes a force multiplier rather than a trap. Finally, consolidate identity and strategy. Awareness, deliberate action, and reflection converge into sovereignty. The basement's invisible scaffolds weaken when behavior is intentional, observation is continuous, and choices are aligned with conscious principles. Mastery is sustained, systemic, and resilient. The critical truth is this: systems endure because they operate below awareness. Multiplier of autonomy rather than a channel of control. Finally, integrate identity, strategy, and vigilance into daily life. Autonomy is not a static achievement. It is a living practice. Maintain deliberate habits, reinforce principles, and observe both yourself and the systems you inhabit. Each conscious act strengthens sovereignty, reducing vulnerability to invisible control. The basement survives in minds unexamined. Mastery exists in minds aware, deliberate, and resilient. You have now seen its architecture, traced its mechanisms, and reclaimed your interior space. Control no longer operates unconsciously. Recognition transforms into freedom, observation into mastery, and understanding into enduring power. Blackwood's legacy, once a tool of silent domination, is now a blueprint for intentional sovereignty. Every choice, every interaction, every ritual can be navigated consciously, and every system can be engaged strategically. Knowledge that was forbidden now becomes the foundation of strength, autonomy, and permanent mastery over influence. You are no longer shaped by unseen authority. You are the architect of your own mind, the strategist of your own choices, and the master of the systems you inhabit. The basement is behind you. Sovereignty lies ahead.